the first thing on our list here in Larry's notes is predictive prophecy, and really, is it authentic? Of course, a lot of this we don't have to deal with. We have the Spirit within us to convict us that all Scripture is inspired by God, and I honestly believe that none of us would believe that without the Spirit. It's just incomprehensible. You can't get there from an intellectual point of view. But having said that, let's just go over. I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these notes. I hope that most of you have these notes so you can go back and look at. There are a couple things I want to stress somewhat. There's some good information. There's a lot of good information in here. But as it pertains to us, we're preaching to the choir. We all believe that this is God's word. And number one, you can see in your notes, the Jewish Christian tradition. This really did not come under question until much later. It's this new age we have, this skepticism and all that emerged really in the 1700s or after that. But, so really, up until that point, people believed that Daniel wrote this book. I mean, it was just accepted. It is number two. It is historically accurate. The predictions concerning world empires, nation of Israel, and the future kingdom are both supernatural and accurate. We see these prophecies come true, and really, as we see in the notes, that's the skeptic's primary problem. How could this? There's no way this could have been written during this early period. The predictions are too accurate. Even secular community and historians realize this, and so that's really the crux of the argument or the problem with it. And if you see in the bottom of number 4, he has a quote from Dwight Pentecost. Such a view, of course, denies the power of God to reveal what he has predetermined. Again, we can't stress this enough, the gift we have, that we know there is a God who's in control of all this. More importantly, we know him. Under scriptural, textual, and historical considerations, number 1, Jesus stated that Daniel was a real historic person, not just a later anonymous writer, a prophet who received authentic divine revelation. He quotes him in Matthew 24:15. The abomination that causes desolation, who had not yet appeared, would appear later. You can read that quote sometime. It's Matthew 24:15. And it goes right in with the prophecy that he's quoting his prophecy and reaffirming it. And of course, Matthew 24 is end time prophecy. This is what's going to happen in the latter days.
Elsie has a question on your chat.
Oh my goodness.
Just check your chat right there.
Where?
Chat.
I
think it says chat somewhere.
All right.
Nope. Here, right here.
Where? Here?
Yep. Over on the side, she asked the question.
Oh Lord. All right. Why did the Jewish community reject Daniel as reliable book or prohibited from reading it? I don't know. Elsie asked, why is the Jewish community, why do they reject Daniel, or why are they prohibited from reading it? I didn't know that they really were. I knew Isaiah 53 is a problem with them, that they really avoid reading that because it's too much to the point. one of the things we get into in these notes is several copies of the Book of Daniel, 4 or 5 copies, I believe, were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls Qumran community. Uh, and this is one of the real hard evidences that points to an earlier time. Uh, Even the secular scholars and the quote religious scholars, when I say quote religious, the Catholic University had a lot of, or at least Fitzmyer, Joseph Fitzmyer, I believe is his first name, were looking into these scrolls, and they were they're not really believers, but they're quite good at the uh, biblical Hebrew and Aramaic of that day, and they recognized that these scrolls were from an earlier period. So Fitzmyer even went as far as saying, "Well, we have to redate this because otherwise this would be predictive prophecy." It's incredible what people do. You see the same thing with evolution. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Other than the Jewish community, we know has been blinded. They rejected the Messiah. And you see a remnant that believes in Jesus today, but it's just that it's a remnant. Um, so pushing on, let's. I kind of want to get through this. Skip down to if you're reading along, number 7. A bit more than half of Daniel is written in Imperial Aramaic. Uh, Remember, these languages are old. It's like Greek. You had different forms of Greek. The Greek in the Hebrew Bible is Koine, but there were Attic and other Greeks, classical Greek. Remember, the language it was around for 600 years before we got Koine Greek. Languages change. And this is true of this Aramaic. And this is a good point because in number 7, biblical Aramaic is not much different from the Elephantine documents attributed to the 5th century. Um, if you look at this, if you do any research on this, you'll see that the Elephantine, documents, they point to a couple things. Number one, Aramaic was prevalent in Egypt. I'm not sure where Elephantine is. They said it was next to Aswan. I know Aswan is in the southern part of Egypt. But these documents were there, and we're talking a date of 495 BC. This is early. It also demonstrates that how far Aramaic had gone. They call it the lingua franca, and really, most of the time that these languages spread because people are doing business with each other. It's an economy. It's a business economy, and really just a communication with the different tradings. So this is documented. They know this, and this is why Fitzmyer had to redate this Imperial Aramaic. I mean, because otherwise it had to be written much earlier than they want to admit to.
Carrie, I have a question, if I may.
Go ahead.
So based on what you're saying, would you say it's a fair statement to equate Biblical Imperial Aramaic to Koine Greek, just from basically 2 different periods where both were used as basically the trade language of the day?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that Aramaic had different forms. Okay, there was this Imperial Aramaic early on. It took a different form late, around 200, 175. It would have been a different form of Aramaic. You would see different tenses, different word uses. Remember, these languages, if you're familiar with inflective, they change forms. Word will change forms and have different meanings. We'll see some of this in Daniel when we get into it. A couple of things I want to point out. But Greek, Koine Greek was common Greek. For a long time, they thought it was a biblical language. They thought they made it up. And then they found Greek that was buried in Egypt, and they had like list of daily activities and things like that, and they found it was written in Koine Greek. And they realized that, like anything, languages change. Look at English, right? We had King James English. It's hard to understand now. That's all I meant by that. But with those different changes, time periods. If this was written in this style of Aramaic, it had to be written earlier. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I'll let you read over the notes just because of time. We have a lot to get through. This is a fairly long chapter. I'd like to get up to a certain point. And really what I'd like to do is what I want to get into is going through this verse by verse. I use the commentators to help with some of the technical things for language or what a word means, but primarily what I want us to do is have our Bible opens and look through this and listen to what God has put out. He's given us a condensed version. This is concise language if you think about it. It's narrative. We think of it as historical, but really he's given us the essence of what we need to know. No one talks. This would be a male conversation. My wife always says, "I want the details." A lot of times things turn on a word or two here. So, but nonetheless, I think a lot of times if we just read carefully, we will see some of the amazing things that Daniel has done, and just to show his humbleness and what a man of God he is. So one thing I want to transition from, we believe that this was written during an earlier period, somewhere around the 6th, 5th century, that Daniel wrote it, and it is predicted prophecy. I want to go back real quick just to give us a setting, because remember, we're trying to look at this from their point of view as much as possible. It applies to us, but what did it apply to the immediate audience during that time? And so just a couple of quick reviews. Larry's has some excellent notes from last week with the introduction. Some things I want to highlight. Remember, Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father, really kind of started. He number one, he defeated the Assyrians in Babylon. Things were chaotic back then. The Assyrian Empire spanned the whole crescent pretty much that you saw Larry point out, the Babylonian Empire. So in other words, it went from Palestine, Jerusalem, up over the crescent, down to Babylon, that Fertile Crescent, right? The interior part is all desert, it's Saudi Arabia, but they controlled that. Nabopolassar defeated the Syrians had a chaotic situation in the Babylonian region, so he took over that first, and he was a Chaldean chieftain, which is interesting. So we're going to see that with the Chaldeans as they come to Nebuchadnezzar. Also, he had a campaign against Assyria, but it was Nebuchadnezzar, right? Who defeated them at Carchemish. That was a big battle. He defeated the remnant of Assyria. Assyria is no longer uh, an empire like it was. He also defeated the remnant of Egypt, right? King Necho, the Pharaoh Necho was defeated there. Uh, think about that. This is where Nebuchadnezzar is coming from. I mean, he must have been on top of the world. His father hasn't died yet. He's about to be made king, and he's an intelligent guy. Also, remember that there is a lot of education. Babylon was an intelligent area. They had mathematics and science. They were at this period by 605. They were the intelligence or kind of the learning area of the world. There's lots of documents they found later with writing and all. And let's face it, with writing, it's any type of learning is a discipline for the mind. Nebuchadnezzar was an intelligent leader. We see him get emotional, and make rash decisions, but nonetheless, he was an intelligent guy. He was. This is an educated community here, so don't look back at him as just mystical. As he brings in his magicians and all that to interpret his dreams. So, having said that, that's kind of the background. Let's start now with the text. Now, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore, declare the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servant, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Verse 12. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy the wise men of Babylon. Now, what I want to do is let's work through this verse by verse, and really let's God's word pretty much unpack what he's trying to teach us here. Now, to begin with, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, there is going to be a difficulty. If you read different commentators, they're going, this is one of the problems. How could have Daniel been promoted at the end of chapter 1 with his friends, and this be the second year of the king's reign. There's 2 points of view. Some have tried to take the numbers and arrange them by accession, which Larry taught you about in week 1. Kings would not be considered the king until maybe the first month of the year, even though they started reigning months before and the tail end of the year before. Even so, there is a problem. It's difficult to have 3 full years here. Leon Wood and another commentary I looked at, his name's escaping me right now, both suggest that there's a possibility that Daniel did in fact interpret this dream before the end of chapter 1, when they were brought before the king and questioned and shown to be 10 times greater than the other years. They don't have a problem reconciling this. Remember, God is not necessarily given this history in a perfect sequential order, much like we see the Gospels. The point is what happened, and really, I think it can be justified. Were all the 4 men brought to Nebuchadnezzar? No, Daniel was. He may have interpreted this before the king. They also said that Daniel may not have been there in chapter 1. It may have been the 4 youths that were brought and tested. Daniel may have already been promoted. Really, we don't see this as a problem. Again, we know that God wrote this word. Also, at the end of, if you look at the end of Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Again, very few words, but in the Aramaic, troubled, the word for troubled is pa'am, and it's it's to strike. Now it's in a form of pa'am. It's reflective. It's as to strike himself. The point is that these 2 words. This is one of these dreams. You wake up in the middle of the night and you're not going back to sleep. His spirit was troubled. Okay. The king gave orders, verse 2, to call the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, and tell the king his dreams. So they stood before the king. In page 4 of Larry's notes, okay, he has some definitions here. The conjurers in page 4 up there, number G, were those who could communicate with the spirit world. The sorcerers were those who practiced witchcraft, but again, the benefit is for the king. And the Chaldeans, this is can be taken in different ways. It could be a class, which kind of seems to be part of the point here, but it's also an ethnic group. Again, that's why I gave you that background. Nabopolassar was a chieftain, a Chaldean chieftain. Obviously, Nabopolassar. Nebuchadnezzar, obviously his son, was of Chaldean heritage. And if you notice, the Chaldeans here seem to be the spokesman. It's his tribe. It's his people he knows. It's where he's from. So they come in and they're called in. Probably early in the morning. A lot of the commentators speculate that this seems to be a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and he immediately wants to know. He's very troubled by this dream. And of course, we know why, because we read ahead. We know the end. It was a dream about a kingdom, his kingdom being uh, the different kingdoms, his one kingdom coming after another. I don't know if he realizes this until Daniel interprets it, but he definitely troubled by this image. Verse 2, then the king gave orders for all these to be the sorcerers, Chaldeans, to tell the king the dream. So they came and stood before the king. Verse 3, the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. The word anxious there, again, is the same word, pa'am. It's in a different form, but his spirit is troubled. They would have known this. Obviously, with the urgency, the Chaldeans would have gone, this is a major problem. The king is very troubled by this. Verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare its interpretation. So immediately they come in. There's a bit of a note there. From this point on, 2:4 through the end of chapter 7, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. Chapter 1 was Hebrew, and it reverts back to Hebrew in the remaining chapters, 8 through 12. It's kind of a normal division. There are two divisions in this book. A lot of the commentators recognize. Chapters 1 through 6 is basically historical. It has dreams and interpretations in there, but it's basically historical of the Babylonian times that Daniel lived in. 7 through 12 is basically prophetic. Okay, so you have a natural division there. But this also points to another division that they see. Aramaic would basically or could indicate that it's this is to the Gentiles. Okay, you're looking at Gentile nations and kingdoms that are rising up. He's predicting the different kingdoms here. With we're going to see the Medo-Persians come along, Greece, Rome. And then eventually, in this one, of course, God's kingdom is going to reign over all. So it's a natural division there. Is the Aramaic or the Hebrew, when it reverts back to Hebrew, we're pretty much talking about God's chosen people, right? It pertains to the Jews, the Hebrews, okay, the restoration, how God is going to work with them. But here it is. Now they enter, the Chaldeans spoke, O king, live forever. So obviously they're humbling themselves or prostrating themselves. They're giving the king his due honor. But then look at the response there. Tell the dream to your servant, and we will declare the interpretation. They're giving the indication that it's almost condescending if you look at it in some ways. It's kind of like, we understand you're upset. You tell us, you, O king, you tell us the dream, and we'll interpret it for you. There's not. I see this in a contrast with the way Daniel deals with this. Number one, there's a confidence. We will, as if they know they can do this, and we're going to see how that is really not the case as the king presses them. I think their confidence is is questionable, and that's exactly where Nebuchadnezzar is going to go with this. Verse 5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn from limb from limb, and your houses will be made rubbish. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and reward and great honor. Therefore, declare to me the dream and its interpretation. So he stated emphatically what he wants. This is what I want. I am troubled. I want you to tell me what the dream is. Okay? If you do, you'll be given great honor. If you don't, you're going to be torn. You're going to be destroyed. And again, it's telling. Verse 7. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will declare the interpretation. Again, they move right beyond what he says. They said they want to go back to it. They just, you tell us the dream, and we'll tell you the interpretation. There's really no compassion. They're not really listening to the king. It's really their kind of agenda. And I believe as we see through this, as we read through this, Nebuchadnezzar sees this. For some reason, he seems to have been skeptical about this the whole time. We're not really told why. I'd like to take just a little mention, just that there must have been at some point for these people to believe in such mysticism and the sorcerers and everything else. I believe that there were probably manifestations. I think of what we went through with Acts when Pastor Leek was talking about Simon in Acts chapter 8, and the people were all impressed with Simon. He was a magician and a sorcerer, and he was able to perform acts. And Pastor Leek said at the time, these were, I'm sure, manifestations of witchcraft, whatever you want to call it, demonic manifestations. We see this in the veils kind of peeled for us in chapter 10 when Daniel's dream, and he's I'm having a brain lock here. The angel comes to him and he says, I've been trying to come to you for 21 days, but I was inhibited by the prince of Persia. We see that there are demonic forces behind all these kingdoms, and it's revealed to us. So I believe that these men probably did manifest it in over periods of time, maybe to Nebuchadnezzar's father. I don't know, but I would imagine that they believed in this and they were able to perform some of these signs. The king replied in verse 8, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen the command from me is firm, that if you do not make known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. Again, this is a major move. Kings had all these magicians and sorcerers and Chaldeans and whatever names you want to give this group. they wanted the interpretations. They believed that the gods would speak to these people. But Nebuchadnezzar's doubting them. He wants to know that they are actually hearing from these gods. I think he suspects back in here their smugness when they answered in verse 4. He goes, "Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation." Like there's no possibility that they would not be able to do so. Now we'll see the contrast with Daniel. Daniel states that the opposite of that. So the Chaldeans, verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one who could declare it to the king except God, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." So again, the Chaldeans answer. He said, "There is not a man who could declare the matter." And really, this is what Nebuchadnezzar suspects all along, and now they're just reaffirming it. But also, I want you to notice and look what they say in the second half. "Inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this, or any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean." There again, look at you see this throughout history, that there seems that these Chaldeans, magicians, these sorcerers, this religious group has a certain power. They're pushing back even now. They're saying, "Wait a minute, no one has done this before. This is not the way it's done." They're talking to a king who can take their life, and yet they seem to talk back with a force and a power where they are have a certain authority in the land, and I'm sure that they have. Maybe a weaker king would have bowed down to this group. Not that Nebuchadnezzar doesn't believe in that they could hear from their gods, and that there are no gods, Marduk and those that they worship in Babylon, but yet that they may not hear from them. But nonetheless, most kings, this is a powerful move for the king. The king is standing up to them. You kind of see this all throughout history. You see the prophets that had to come to the kings and push back against the king because the king wasn't acting properly, and vice versa. A lot of the kings would not like the prophets. As you saw what they did. They put them in jail. They put them in dungeons because they didn't like the prophecy. They didn't prophesy the way that the kings wanted to. It's no different here. So we have a power struggle going on. Verse 11, "Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult. There is no one else who could declare it to the king except God, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." Well, this is what Nebuchadnezzar knows all along. He's thinking, well, if you don't talk to the God, you're not going to be able to give me this interpretation. If I tell it to you, you're just going to tell me something, and how am I going to know if it's correct? Verse 12, "Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon." Again, they challenged his authority. Nebuchadnezzar has said, "I don't believe you. I think all you've done, as I stated up here, is you've gotten together. You're going to speak corrupt and lying words to me. You're just going to put me off." And so he he gives kind of a rash order here. He says, "Let's destroy all uh, these men, these magicians, these Chaldeans, these interpreters. Let's destroy them all." Uh, this would have been this shows the power that the king of Babylon had at this time. You don't see that. You see it when the Persian kings came along, and you remember the Daniel, or when the Daniel in the lion's den. Once he made the edict, he couldn't go against the edict. This isn't true in this Babylonian period. Nebuchadnezzar he says what goes, and what goes goes. If he changes his mind, he's able to do that. He's a different strength and a different power than the kings that preceded him. But nonetheless, it's kind of a rash decision. Also, this would affect the people. It wasn't just a king. Remember, all the people are looking up to these wise men, these magi, these magicians, to interpret what the gods want for the country. Their gods are kind of judgmental, and you have to appease the gods. They don't have a relationship with the god. You can see the distance here when in verse 11, when they say their gods whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. They're distant. They're kind of afar. They're not the relational God that we have, and the God that Daniel had. God spoke to Daniel. God speaks to us. Their idols don't typically speak to them. If they do, it's demonic manifestations, right? Idols are basically demons. It's demonic. So, in verse 13, so the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. And this is then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" And then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. I want to stop there. This, again, Daniel and obviously was not informed. He wasn't present when the wise men were called. This is another point where people think that commentators would say that Daniel had and his friends, had not been promoted at this time. They were not there with the assembly of wise men to help the king interpret the dream. They were still in training. But again, Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain. Daniel is blessed from God. He's able to approach people and give them the honor that's due. When he recognizes that Arioch is certainly a man that, well, he came to take his life, but even so, he's a man that Daniel must pay homage to. He must respect his authority, his position. I think we really see the contrast with this and the magicians, the Chaldeans. They felt of a certain amount of authority and position and power on their own. So he responds this way. Daniel replied this way to the captain of the bodyguard. And he said to Arioch, the king's commander, for what reason the decree from the king is so urgent? And Arioch informed him about the matter. He stopped it and listened to Daniel.
Can I interject?
Yes.
So if you look at Daniel 1, and you look at who Daniel is, he may have come from the royal and noble heritage of Judea.
Right.
He was chosen based on his intellectual capacities and also his, what we call, social rank.
Right.
Okay, so his appeal to Arioch is very much in line with somebody who had very strong, high social ranking.
Right.
Yeah, so he's responding not as other biblical characters, but he's actually responding in a very politically correct, he's following protocol very exactly. Like he's following protocol to the T and how he's approaching this king.
Absolutely.
Right. You see it in him. You see it all the way through Daniel's life, that he has a strong understanding of diplomacy.
Absolutely. And you know, let's just take a sidebar here. Doesn't this apply to all of life, even in secular relationships and business and the people that really succeed the most operate in this manner. You hear it about great CEOs and presidents of companies. Typically, they're humble people. They recognize those that work under them. I think of Jack Welch, GE, who got so much acclaim. He was a studier of his people. He recognized their strength. He promoted people, and yeah, he dealt with them in the same kind of manner. It's a universal truth that works throughout life, whether we know God or not. God has truths that right. You don't have to be religious. You could be totally secular and still apply these principles, and they work. We're going to see, and yes, we're going to see this even more as we actually. A quick thing you said, chapter 1, and oh boy, we're out of time.
That's why, Terry, we are at 10:45, which is the end time for the class. And
let me just make one quick point. In Daniel 1, when Daniel asked for his food, turn over to Daniel 1. We'll end with this. Just real quick. You brought it up. It's on my mind. Daniel 1. Starting in 9, right? God granted compassion and favor, right? And he's talking to Ashpenaz, the commander, and he asked him to give the vegetables. He goes, "Why should my head be, I could lose my head over this." But look at verse 11. But Daniel said to the overseer, "This is not Ashpenaz. This is a man, a Melzar it's called, and he's either a guard or a steward." Okay, is the way it would be translated. But look at what he says to this guard or steward. "Please test your servants." He is recognizing this Melzar who's bringing him the food. Can you imagine today, Ivy League students is what I was thinking about, how they would treat somebody like this? We're the young, we're the upper crust here. We're going to the Ivy League school. We're not your servants, you're our servants. But he recognizes, hey, this guy may be low, but he can also take my life. So yeah. That's a reality we need to pull out. I am going to have to speed forward next week. Will we end in prayer real quick, Larry?
Yes, that'll be fine.
Heavenly Father, Lord, help us to speed up next time. Lord, there's so much to get through. We're going to focus on why we believe that these kingdoms, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, who they are, why they are what they are predicted to be. Lord, give us the grace to see this, Lord. Help us this week as we go through. Help us to have the mind of Daniel, the compassion, the faith of Daniel, because our God is his God. We have that same God. Lord, bless our time as we look at the worship, as we join in online. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Sure. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, guys.
And,
Thank you, Carrie. It was so good.
yeah. Well, at this time, we'll end this meeting. And so just, you want to log in into the regular meeting, regular service that begins at U-Heaven. So again, thank you for coming, and we'll meet at in the same way next week.